Today's episode is brought to you by Enlisted. The late medieval and early modern periods were marked by a widespread fear of witchcraft and the subsequent persecution of individuals, primarily women, who were accused of being not only witches, but those who went as far as to copulate with the devil himself. The Malleus Maleficarum played a significant role in promoting and legitimising such persecution. After being spearheaded by infamous inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, the text, often referred to as the Hammer of Witches, was used as a manual for witch hunters, providing them with instructions on identifying, interrogating, and punishing witches in the 15th century. As is the case in the previous chapter, the principal author Heinrich Kramer spends much of his time calling upon religious texts to support his argument, most notably loose interpretations of Ecclesiasticus. And whilst he was undoubtedly successful in conveying his arguments at the time, a lot of his perspective falls flat with the modern attitudes of today. In fact, much of Kramer's ramblings do quickly remind me of a madman's scribblings, as he darts, sometimes incoherently, from point to point, in an effort to not only slam the witch, but to also explain the role of demons, the heresy of man, and the childlike belief of magic. But in the next chapter of this fruitcake's masterpiece, Kramer takes aim at women in a far more scathing manner and seeks to justify the deeply entrenched misogyny and gender bias that was prevalent during this period of history. Before we continue, a brief message from the sponsor of today's video, Enlisted. Enlisted is an MMO squad-based shooter that features insane battles from infantry firefights, vehicular assaults, and aviation dogfights. Join in on both PvP and PvE combat as you lead your soldiers into some of the most notorious battles in history, including fighting on the side of the United States, Germany, the Soviet Union, and Japan, where you'll see real-life military equipment, uniforms, and specialized vehicles. The latest update of Enlisted has seen the game introduce whole skill trees for weapons and vehicles, meaning you can upgrade your abilities and roles for each of your soldiers, as well as matchmaking based on your preferred equipment and quality of life improvements that were developed in collaboration with the community's player base. Historical accuracy is a big part of this game, and you can even commandeer real-life weaponry, including the infamous German King Tiger or the more specialized American Johnson LMG. Enlisted offers such a huge arsenal, more than 400 weapons to be precise, that you won't be lacking in firepower in this new era of the game. Take command of AI-controlled soldiers and lead them into huge skirmishes against the squads of your real-time opponents. Whilst playing Enlisted, I really enjoyed the realism found in each encounter, specifically the fact that enemy vehicles don't have hit points, but instead suffer actual visual damage to their structure, as well as the crew inside. This level of immersion makes it feel like you're actually there participating in the skirmish, so be sure to aim your shots carefully as you decimate the enemy army. Play Enlisted for free on PC, PlayStation or Xbox now by using my link in the pinned comment or video description. New players on PC will also receive a special bonus pack that includes multiple items, 4,000 silver, and 3 days of premium account. The offer is available for a limited time only, so make sure not to miss it. And now back to today's episode. Now it should be noted, as is the case for pretty much the entirety of the Hammer of Witches, that Kramer continuously drew upon selective interpretation of religious scripture in order to justify the negative portrayal of women, atheists, and pretty much anyone who didn't agree with him. As mentioned, Kramer's go-to source for much of his beliefs was Ecclesiasticus, a Jewish work from approximately the 2nd century that consists mostly of ethical teachings. With this, he was able to bend and warp the words of what was essentially an ancient text, even in his days, and was able to further incite the already negative portrayal of women by bruiting the idea that they were not only the weaker sex, both mentally and spiritually, but that they were also more susceptible to superstition, possession, and even the charms of evil. With this, Kramer asks the question in chapter 4 concerning witches who copulate with devils. Why is it that women are chiefly addicted to evil superstitions? Much of the text homes in on the stereotypical nature of women, and why they were more likely to become agents of Satan than men were. One argument Kramer makes throughout this chapter is that women are more credulous, making them easy targets for the devil's influence. Kramer presents the narrative that men were just simply smarter than women, and so, because of this intrinsic intelligence, they were much less likely to fall for the wiles of Satan than women were. Women, by this definition, were more likely to believe what they heard. They were far more impressionable, and such a trait made them more vulnerable to the influence of malevolent spirits. At first, I was surprised to see that Kramer didn't bring up the Adam and Eve argument straight away here, where I don't think it would be completely out of his character to slate Eve for having listened to the serpent, before using Eve as a template to define every other woman in existence in his time. But then, he does do exactly this at the end of the chapter, so you might say he was saving his most obvious trump card for last. In any case, the concept of women being more impressionable as far as evil spirits went also lent to the idea that women were more likely to be emotionally unstable, making them unreliable as far as trust, loyalty, and honesty went. Furthermore, the text also makes note of women having slippery tongues, and that because of this characteristic, it was difficult for them to keep secrets, furthermore reinforcing an old stereotype that women were prone to gossip and deceit. Lastly, there's also the carnal nature of women, that Kramer makes it known is another characteristic that makes women not only untrustworthy, but more likely to turn to witchcraft in the first place, because they are both emotionally and physically weak to the evilness around them. From just a glance, we can already see the misogynistic rhetoric seeping in from this text. Having read the first 3 chapters of the Malleus Maleficarum, as seen on this channel, you can clearly tell that this is the moment that Kramer's bitterness towards the opposite sex really starts to shine through. Indeed, it's as if Kramer turned his filter off as he began to pen chapter 6, and instead of holding his tongue for the sake of sounding neutral, decided to go all in with his dark beliefs. Beliefs that would see to the execution of thousands of women in the hundreds of years that followed. So what exactly does Kramer say in this chapter? Kramer starts off by addressing the fact that it is very difficult to understand and explain the nature and the process of women who copulate with demons, and/or the devil. Of course, this doesn't stop him from trying, as he proceeds to first put the devil under the spotlight. He asks several questions, including, does the devil appear in a hideous form, or does he take on a more handsome form in an effort to seduce the woman? Does the devil use his own semen to impregnate the woman? Or does he operate like a succubus, stealing the semen from man and using it thereafter? When, where, and under what circumstances do these trysts take place? Furthermore, can anyone actually see these things taking place? Or perhaps, do they take place on some kind of spiritual plane? To these questions, Kramer provides no answers. He then puts the woman under the spotlight and asks the questions, is it only women who were born under the same circumstances who become entranced by the devil too? Or can any woman be seduced by the devil? Can it be possible that only those who were offered to the devil by midwives at birth can be seduced by him? Is the actual veneral delectation of such of a weaker sort? This one made me crack up a little bit, because whilst I'm not 100% sure of Kramer's intentions with this question, it does sound like he's curious as to whether the pleasure of a woman's experiences is better with a man or better with Satan. In answer to all these questions, Kramer completely cops out and tells us that we cannot here reply to all these questions, both because we are only engaged in a general study, and because in the second part of this work, they are all singly explained by their operations, as will appear in the 4th chapter, where mention is made of each separate method. In other words, Kramer tells us that he doesn't know the answer to these questions, without actually telling us that he doesn't know the answers. Primarily, he refers to this as a general study, which is a pretentious effort to not only make his beliefs sound more complicated, but to also belittle us into believing that there's more to his wild theories. He also promises that in the second part of his work, he'll go into everything in more detail and catch us up to speed. He then moves briskly back onto women, where he states, therefore, let us now chiefly consider women, and first, why this kind of perfidy is found more in so fragile a sex than in men. In order to explain this, Kramer attempts to break it down for us into 3 categories, telling us that there are 3 elements within society that can either do incredibly good things or incredibly wicked things. These are number 1, the tongue, number 2, the church, or the ecclesiastic, and number 3, women. These, Kramer tells us, have an extreme tendency to be very good or very bad, and that when they are guided by good intentions, they are virtuous, but when influenced by evil intentions, they can exhibit terrible behaviours. Let's look at the tongue first. Kramer states, this is clear in the case of the tongue, since by its ministry, most of the kingdoms have been brought into the faith of Christ, and the Holy Ghost appeared over the apostles of Christ in tongues of fire. Other learned preachers also have had, as it were, the tongues of dogs, licking wounds and sores of the dying Lazarus. As it is said, with the tongues of dogs, ye save your souls from the enemy. He aims to show us that tongues, in a more literal sense, are recognized in scripture as being a body part capable of achieving good things. The tongue isn't evil when used correctly, and with the tongue, one can spread the word of Christ. As he specifies, it is by the tongue's ministry that most of the kingdoms have been brought into the faith of Christ. He also uses the tongues of the dogs, in the case of the dying Lazarus in the Gospel of Luke, as a means to show that the tongue can even save the life of another. Of course, using the tongue to speak is one thing, but using the tongue to lick? I don't know, I think Kramer was being too literal here. But we get the point nonetheless. The tongue, or perhaps more simply, the word of mouth, can achieve great things, from inspiring a nation, soothing the afflicted, and even delivering joy. Our words have power, and this is a good thing when used morally and correctly. On the other hand though, with the power of the tongue is also the potential for evil. The malicious tongue can cause harm and conflict, which Kramer proceeds to illustrate by deploying his endless arsenal of Ecclesiasticus, telling us, a backbiting tongue hath disquieted many, and driven them from nation to nation. Strong cities hath it pulled down, and overthrown the houses of great men. And by a backbiting tongue, it means a third party who rashly or spitefully interferes between 2 contending parties. Kramer then moves on to talk about the second category of his point, the church, or the ecclesiastic. He tells us here that clerics and the religious of either sex do have the potential to commit terrible sins, and that just because someone, again of either sex, adopts the identity of a holy person doesn't necessarily make them a good person. He states, from the priesthood arises everything good and everything evil, which for once is something that most people will likely concur with. In essence, Kramer seeks here to caution people of putting too much faith in the church and in priests, because even though they have a spiritual understanding, and likely a textbook understanding of God, they are not divine and are not God themselves, and so one should not place the clergy on a pedestal. Secondarily, he also warns of clerics using their position for personal gain, and that these sorts of people are causing much harm to the church of which they claim to work for. He even proceeds to quote from St. Jerome in his epistle to Nepotian, saying, "Avoid as you would the plague a trading priest, who has risen from poverty to riches, from a low to high estate." He is also seen to quote St. Bernard in his 23rd homily on the Psalms to further illustrate his point, where the saint declares, "If one should arise as an open heretic, let him be cast out and put to silence. If he is a violent enemy, let all good men flee from him. But how are we to know which ones to cast out or to flee from? For they are confusedly friendly and hostile, peaceable and quarrelsome, neighbourly and utterly selfish." So put simply, Kramer warns readers not to put too much faith in the church, and that even these men who claim to be holy are just as capable of the evils that the common man might be capable of. With this, we move on to the third category of Kramer's point, and indeed, the most venomous: women. If I was to cut some slack for Kramer, I would say that he does specify that women can be virtuous and bring blessings to society. But it takes a hell of a while for him to get there, and not before he drills home the point that women's actions can be driven by evil. Also, as I later explain, most of his praise for women is not only conditional, but backhanded too. Once more, he fires off from Ecclesiasticus, saying, "There is no head above the head of a serpent, and there is no wrath above the wrath of a woman. I had rather dwell with a lion and a dragon than to keep house with a wicked woman." One of the most striking things about such potent words is that it isn't clear where they actually come from. Kramer's efforts to quote from Ecclesiasticus, amongst other early church fathers, seem to only confirm his own personal bias, and appear to condemn the woman not for any specific traits, but for simply being a woman in the first place. Indeed, he does refer to the woman in this instance as wicked, but he doesn't go on to specify what constitutes being a wicked woman, nor whether the same applies to being a man. It's quite clear from this quote alone where Kramer stood. He believed women were capable of far more evils than men, despite all the wars and everything, and believed that the evil of women was so potent that it even exceeded the evils of the supernatural, the dragon in this case. So it would come as no surprise where Kramer got the notion that women were more likely to be witches because they were more likely to be evil and had a capacity to fall for the devil that men did not. Of course, his tirade against women isn't done here, as he proceeds to quote from 5th century Archbishop of Constantinople, John Chrysostom, saying, "It is not good to marry. What else is a woman but a foe to friendship, an inescapable punishment, a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable calamity, a domestic danger, a delectable detriment, an evil of nature, painted with fair colours. Therefore, if it be a sin to divorce her when she ought to be kept, it is indeed a necessary torture, for either we commit adultery by divorcing her, or we must endure daily strife." Again, Kramer takes no prisoners with his approach, as he handpicks a rather venomous quote from Chrysostom to illustrate his point. With this, he paints women as being physically beautiful by design, not because it can be reflective of their nature, but instead because this beauty is a trap for men. However, he does not chastise the man for falling for this more carnal desire, and frames man's lust not as weakness, but as a natural part of life. It is not man's fault that he finds woman attractive, which may lead him to falling for her. It's the woman's fault for being attractive, and using her beauty to, in effect, enslave the man in what he describes as inescapable punishment. He rather candidly warns readers, of which were men, not to marry, and that because divorce was frowned upon in those times, a man would therefore be stuck with the woman he chose, of which he would undoubtedly find out that while she was delectable, she would also be his detriment. It's almost quite humorous how he describes marriage thereafter as daily strife for the man, almost framing all the relationship problems within said marriage as being the fault of the woman. Pretty much every line in this quote is quite shocking. Women are a necessary evil, suggesting that if a man wanted children, he had to be with a woman, and thus he had to marry her in those times and had to share the child with her. He describes her as evil, but never really goes into why she's evil. He dehumanizes the woman because in this text, she isn't another human being, no, she's a natural temptation. She isn't man's equal, but rather relegated to being an object, a thing that has a singular purpose, to tempt man and lead him to disaster. You can't even be friends with women according to this text, because women are a foe to friendship. Kramer isn't done there though. He can't help himself but slide in a few mini quotes from Roman philosophers, some of which I can't help but feel were taken out of context. From the Rhetorics by Roman philosopher Cicero, he quotes, "The many lusts of men lead them into one sin, but the lust of women leads them into all sins, for the root of all women's vices is avarice." With this, Kramer aims to paint the point that sure, lust leads men into committing adultery, which I'm sure he'd argue is also the woman's fault, but that lust leads women into all sins, not just adultery. The reason for this? Well, he aims to convey that the root of all women's weakness is greed, particularly the greed for materialistic gain or money. Put simply, he's trying to say that the worst thing a man can do when he gets lustful thoughts is have an affair, or maybe have sex outside of wedlock, considering the time period. But the worst thing a woman can do when she gets lustful thoughts is basically everything. Not just because of their evil nature, but because they're also really greedy. Once again, it's easy to see why, with this sort of mindset, that Kramer would come to insist that women were more likely to become witches and sleep with the devil, because their lust knew no bounds. Combined with their evil nature, it was their lust for money, power, fame, and pretty much anything you could think of that would drive them to do drastic things, even dabbling with the dark arts and sleeping with Satan. Kramer's not done having a go at women there though. He goes on to quote from Seneca's Tragedies, saying, "A woman either loves or hates, there is no third grade, and the tears of women are a deception, for they may spring from true grief, or they may be a snare. When a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil." Thankfully, this is the last outrageous quote that Kramer comes out with, though in some ways it is also one of the more significant in terms of historical attitude. First of all, he remarks that whilst women may truly cry out of grief or sadness, they might also cry out in deception, perhaps in an effort to manipulate men and get them to feel sorry for them. He indicates here that men are not capable of doing the same thing. In fact, it's probable that Kramer lived under the illusion that men didn't cry at all, and if they did, it's only because a woman probably made him cry. The statement, which actually came out of Roman times, given that it was written by Stoic philosopher Seneca, is pretty reflective of its attitude of what made a man during these times, and how for over 1,000 years from when it was first written, all the way up to Kramer's age, the idea of men not crying and or not showing emotion was rigidly upheld. Considering this came from a Stoic philosopher, it's arguable that the showing of emotion was not considered a weakness necessarily, but more so a sign of internal strength and heightened mental fortitude. But here, Kramer uses the quote to outline his perceived difference of men and women, that men held the capacity to achieve this stoic state, but women did not. Worse yet, not only were women more likely to cry, they were also likely to fake cry to manipulate men. In short, Kramer really hammers home the point that women could not be trusted, and that with this idea, women didn't even need witchcraft to deceive men. They could do it with their bodies, their beauty, their words, and apparently, even their tears. Lastly, Kramer also takes aim at women being independent thinkers. As he quotes again from Seneca's Tragedies, "When a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil." Again, this shows us another historical angle of how women were perceived in those times, that they weren't built nor encouraged to be people who had their own ideas. Much less were they celebrated or even expected to have original, free-thinking concepts that existed independently from the ideas shared by their male peers. As far as Kramer and similar thinkers of his time had decided, women were better off not thinking at all, and if they did think by themselves, they were only likely to think up evil. It really does delineate a darker historical attitude that enabled a more insidious form of control, exhibited by men over women. The prevalence of such an attitude would not only mentally handcuff a woman to her male counterpart, but it would see much of her own choices and ideas delegated by the male she was essentially answerable to. In a way, it almost makes the women sound like children, who cannot be left alone to even consolidate their thoughts, because if they did so unsupervised, something bad was bound to happen. With this, Kramer aims to support his notion once again that the free-thinking independent woman was more likely to dabble in witchcraft and become an agent, if not a lover, of Satan, because she didn't possess the same moral and ethical sense that a man did, and that again, like a child, didn't know any better. But believe it or not, it's not all doom and gloom for the man that many today will likely label a 15th century incel. He does go on to praise women, which is about as backhanded as you might expect. Honestly, after his explosive vitriol in the previous section, it's almost like telling someone they look pretty after systematically assassinating their character. He tells us, "But for the good women, there is so much praise, that we read they have brought beatitude to men, and have saved nations, lands, and cities, as is clear in the case of Judith, Deborah, and Esther." Here he does kind of backtrack by essentially telling us it's not all women, and that some women, after all his diatribe, are actually good and worthy of such praise. But it's worth looking into why he thinks these women are good, because in the case of Judith, Deborah and Esther from the biblical narrative, they save nations, save lands, and most importantly, they save men. So a woman isn't good because she produces children, or nurtures life, or demonstrates compassion, love and empathy. No, according to Kramer, a woman is effectively good because she brings beatitude to men. You can see why I describe this praise he offers as backhanded, because he isn't praising women independently, but only praising them for what they can do in conjunction with bettering men. This woman in question, despite bettering men, is still not exempt from being evil at nature, mind you. She's just less likely to exhibit evil if she's benefiting her husband. As he continues, if a woman hath a husband that believeth not, let her not leave him, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the believing wife. Once more, what he is essentially trying to tell us is that not all women have an evil nature, just the ones who are not faithful to God and those who do not bring good tidings to their husbands. You'll notice that in this quote, the husband is sanctified by the believing wife, but alternatively, the same is not the case if the gender roles are reversed. Colour me surprised. Kramer concludes, "Blessed is the man who has a virtuous wife, for the number of his days shall be doubled." And throughout that chapter, in Ecclesiasticus, much high praise is spoken of the excellence of good women, as also in the last chapter of Proverbs, concerning a virtuous woman. Indeed, much high praise is spoken of the excellence of good women in Ecclesiasticus and in Proverbs, but does Kramer dedicate long paragraphs to exemplify this sentiment? Nope. We see him spout a few examples of good Christian women, in a nondescript way, as he references virgins and other holy women leading nations and kingdoms away from the worship of idols in the New Testament. He makes some vague references to the works by Dominican friar Vincent of Bovis, and how if one was to read these works, they'd find examples of marvellous things women have done. Does he bring himself to supply us with any of these examples himself? Of course not. In fact, as if to smear every nice thing he just said about women, he concludes, "I have found women more bitter than death, and good women subject to carnal lust." Well, we almost made progress. He then circles back to his original question as to why women are more susceptible to the devil, and why women tend to be the dabblers of superstition in comparison to men. As is usually the case with Kramer's ideas, the reasons behind his thought process are threefold. The first reason he speaks of here is that women are more likely to believe things they are told, and that since the devil's strategy is to lead people away from God, women make the perfect targets. He tells us, and the first is that they are more credulous, and since the chief aim of the devil is to corrupt faith, therefore he rather attacks them. This is in line with pretty much everything he's said about women so far. They shouldn't be allowed to think on their own because they'll end up thinking about evil. They don't have the same heightened moral sense of men, so they'll end up listening to the devil anyway. And they by default have a greedy nature, so with the devil's offer of money, power and fame, women are more likely to enter an agreement with him. Annoyingly, it's actually one of the few chapters from this book where Kramer says one thing in the beginning and unanimously sticks to it with uncanny resolve. Seriously, his focus in this chapter to condemn and scrutinize women is unparalleled compared to many of his other chapters, where he starts off saying one thing, deviates, and then concludes with differing implications. The second reason women are more likely to succumb to witchcraft and the devil is because Kramer believed women were more impressionable. He states the second reason is that women are naturally more impressionable and more ready to receive the influence of a disembodied spirit, and that when they use this quality, they are very good, but when they use it ill, they are very evil. Again, this is pretty in line with much of what he's been spouting since the beginning of the chapter. Unlike the moral paragons that men are painted out to be like, women are the weak link in society. So the fact that they'd be the weak link spiritually comes as no surprise here. Kramer does attempt to praise women again here, saying that if a woman was influenced by good spirits, then she can do very good things with this. But on the other hand, if she's influenced by evil spirits, then guess what? That's just typical, given the woman's evil nature. The third reason why women are more likely to succumb to witchcraft and the devil is because, according to Kramer, women are untrustworthy and more likely to gossip. He tells us, the third reason is that they have slippery tongues and are unable to conceal from fellow women those things which by evil arts they know, and since they are weak, they find an easy and secret manner of vindicating themselves by witchcraft. Again, pretty much in tune with everything he said so far about women. If anything, we can praise Kramer's consistency for once. After this, we see him do that which I expected him to do at the very beginning. He plays the Eve card. In the traditional Genesis tale, we see the serpent, Satan, convince Eve that eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil would not kill her, as God had told her it would, and that despite God's instructions not to eat from this tree, eating from this tree was perfectly safe. When a woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. Because Eve was the one who spoke to the serpent, and because Eve was the one who took from the tree before sharing it with Adam, many have come to associate temptation and credulity with Eve. And because Eve was the first woman, it has since spawned an idea that all women by this standard must share the same negative traits as Eve. Eve by this idea was gullible, she was greedy, she chose to listen to the devil over God, and she also convinced Adam, thus bringing his downfall, into eating from the tree too. Naturally, this idea fits perfectly in Kramer's holsters, and it isn't beyond him to draw them and shoot, as he tells us, for it is true that in the Old Testament, the scriptures have much that is evil to say about women, and this because of the first temptress, Eve, and her imitators. It's interesting that Kramer describes Eve as a temptress, considering that the standalone Bible does not exactly describe Eve as tempting Adam, at least not in the same way she was tempted. She gives Adam the fruit, but there is no specific indication that she beguiled Adam, nor that Adam expressed any sort of resistance in the face of such temptation. Instead, with this labeling of Eve as a temptress, Kramer almost shifts the blame of Adam's, and therefore man's, downfall onto Eve, which effectively becomes a metaphor for women being blamed for the downfall of men. Indeed, such an idea sits neatly with Kramer's suggestions that women tempt and seduce men into sin, because women are evil, and etc, etc. He also proceeds to label all the following women after Eve as imitators, which shows us that he believed that the behaviour and nature that he so detested in the opposite sex stems solely from the first woman. Interestingly, we do see him speak here very briefly of the sin of Eve being taken away by the benediction of Mary, and that because of this, preachers should always say as much praise of women as possible. In a way, it's almost like he's saying that women aren't a lost cause, and that in actuality, women do have the capacity to be good. He's been pretty stingy with the praise of women himself, so maybe here, near the end of the chapter, he starts to come around? Ha, more fool you. He carries on immediately, but because in these times this perfidy is more often found in women than in men, as we learn by actual experience, if anyone is curious as to the reason, we may add to what has already been said the following: that since they are feebler, both in mind and body, it is not surprising that they should come under the spell of witchcraft. In regards to the mind here, Kramer was not subtle in establishing his opinion that men were just naturally smarter than women, not just in terms of mental fortitude, but in terms of intelligence too. In Kramer's opinion, despite the benediction of Mary, which Kramer attributes to why women weren't all bad, he still believed that women were more deceitful than men, and it was because of this deceit that they found witchcraft and the dark arts a more attractive avenue to explore. On the subject of intelligence, or at least an understanding of things of a spiritual nature, Kramer argues that because the nature of men and women was so different, both men and women would have different attitudes and values when it came to being a good, God-fearing person. Women are intellectually like children, Kramer remarks, aiming to further shape his view that because men and women thought so differently, one was bound to lean more towards evil than the other. By comparing them to children, Kramer attempts to portray the woman as immature, undeveloped, and lacking of any real-world experience. Children are more likely to behave in a disruptive way because they don't know any better and are unable to express their emotions. So lumping women into the same category isn't just insulting, but it's even more of a glimpse of Kramer's perspective of women and why he thought they'd be more likely to try their hand with the devil's work. After this, he proceeds to give a more natural reason as to why women might have been more likely to adopt witchcraft and why they might have been seduced by Satan. He tells us, but the natural reasons is that she is more carnal than a man, as is clear from her many carnal abominations, and it should be noted that there was a defect in the formation of the first woman, since she was formed from a bent rib, that is, a rib of the breast, which is bent, as it were, in a contrary direction to a man, and since through this defect she is an imperfect animal, she always deceives. Once more, Kramer reverts back to putting Eve in his crosshairs, but in a way, he also scrutinizes his God's handiwork. Many will know that the traditional Genesis tale tells us that God fashioned woman, Eve, from one of Adam's ribs. So the Lord God caused man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. Kramer refers to this creation as a defect, in that the rib she was formed from was bent, being the rib of the breast. Thus, from the very basis of her creation, she was already in contradiction to man. On the one hand, it might be said that Kramer is trying to argue that women were purposely made in opposition to men. In her most basic form, she was a rib that was in contrary direction to man, and so from the very get-go, the two were not mutually aligned, and thus separated. But on the other hand, does this mean that Kramer's God made a mistake? Again, it's quite forward for a man of faith to describe his God's handiwork as defective, yet it would seem that Kramer's hatred for the opposite sex superseded his fear of his God, and so he risks referring to one of God's creations as a botched job if it means he can successfully insult and degrade women one more time. Kramer continues to take potshots at women by quoting various Roman Stoics, including Cato the Younger, which again have the effects of making women seem devious, unfaithful, and ultimately evil. He even aims to portray Samson's wife as evil, given that she coaxed him to tell her the riddle he had propounded to the Philistines, and that through this coaxing, it was demonstrative of how evil women can be, and how women possess the guile and deceptiveness to extract any information out of man, and that they aren't afraid to use these powers to their advantage. He also continues his assault of Eve by insinuating that she couldn't have been that good to begin with, considering that she disobeyed God's only command and aligned herself with Satan instead, much as he believes was the case in his time as far as the witch was concerned. Laughably, Kramer even scrutinizes the etymology of the word female, femina in Latin, and how it comes from the words fe and minus. As far as I know, fe in Latin is the abbreviation of ferrum and the subsequent chemical symbol for iron, whilst minus is exactly what it sounds like. It's less than. So I'm not sure what Kramer was trying to make out of the first part of femina, but the second part, he's definitely trying to apply minus to mean that femina, females, are less than males in virtually every capacity, especially when it comes to the preservation of faith. This is ironic because after making this point, he then proceeds to talk about the Virgin Mary, and how, even though she was a woman, her faith never failed her, even when it failed other men during Christ's passion. This isn't the first time that Kramer presents the idea that women can be good, but his concept is flawed because there is no middle ground here. There is no room for a more morally complex woman. By this logic, a woman can only be super good, or she is super bad. And because there are so few women as good as the Virgin Mary, the rest are stuffed into the only category left available: bad women. In a way, it's almost as if Kramer had set his expectations of women so unachievably high that when any woman falls short of it, they immediately become evil in his eyes. It's strange that he never sets this standard for other men. He never expects his fellow man to exemplify the moral superiority of someone like Jesus, but rather is lackadaisical when admonishing their shortcomings, and all too quick to find a way to blame women for them. To sum him up in this section, women are far quicker to wane in their faith, and consequently, quicker to abjure the faith, which he tells us is the root of witchcraft. Kramer continues of the natural will of women, but as far as I can tell, he appears to attack women based on his perceived notion that women hate men that find other spouses, or that they irrationally despise the men they had formerly loved, stating, "And as to her other mental quality, that is, her natural will, when she hates someone whom she formerly loved, then she seethes with anger and impatience in her whole soul, just as the tides of the sea are always heaving and boiling." With this, Kramer paints the woman who has been wronged by love as acrimonious. To him, there is no one more volatile and angry as the woman who is scorned by love, and should she be abandoned, divorced, or left for another woman, she will hold a great resentment for the man that is unlike any resentment ever known. Perhaps this perceived injustice is another reason why, according to Kramer, that women, particularly those scorned by their partners, were more likely to take solace in the arms of the devil and find relief in witchcraft. To illustrate the animosity here, Kramer quotes again from Seneca's tragedies, "No might of the flames or the swollen winds, no deadly weapon, is so much to be feared as the lust and hatred of a woman who has been divorced from the marriage bed." Lastly, Kramer tells us that the most powerful cause which contributes to the increase of witchcraft was the woeful rivalry between married folk and unmarried women and men. What he essentially tries to tell us here is that the unmarried woman harbours a potent jealousy for the married woman. She wants what the married woman has, the husband, the children, perhaps even the lifestyle, but for whatever circumstances, she does not have them, which incites in her a terrible envy. In an effort to bring this idea to life, Kramer tries to outline the relationship between various biblical characters, showing us examples of how envious and impatient Sarah was of Hagar when she conceived Abraham's baby, or how jealous Rachel was of Leah, because Leah had bore Jacob's sons and she could not, or how Martha was jealous of Mary Magdalene, because she was kept busy and Mary was sitting down. What he's trying to say here is that despite his last point that women who are scorned by men will in turn hate that man with a passion, women also hate other women with a passion, particularly those who are perceived to be better off than them. How this links in with them being more likely to practice witchcraft isn't specified by Kramer. Are we to believe that the scorned lover is more likely to turn to the arms of Satan? Or are we to believe that the jealous woman who despises her sister is more likely to turn to witchcraft as a result? If you were to ask Kramer, he'd probably nod with glee. As is customary at this point, Kramer concludes the chapter with Ecclesiasticus with a warning. Neither consult with a woman touching her of whom she is jealous, meaning that it is useless to consult with her, since there is always jealousy, that is, envy in a wicked woman. And if women behave thus to each other, how much more will they do so to men? I probably should have put this at the start of the video, but I'll state it here for the record nonetheless. Most of Kramer's ideas are pretty deplorable, especially considering that it is with such ideas that thousands of women were accused, hunted, tortured, and executed under the belief that they were practicing witchcraft. Kramer believed that the reason why it was women as opposed to men being tried as witches was because women were evil. But from a modern perspective, it's very easy to see that women were tried for witchcraft because women were the ones being accused of it. Sure, there were accounts of men being executed for practicing witchcraft. That's evidenced all over Europe, but the number of women accused by comparison is simply disproportionate. It should also be noted that many women were tortured for their confessions. Seldom did anyone come and readily admit to being a witch, because they knew they'd be killed. These confessions only came after grim, laborious torture, and I'm pretty sure anyone, male or female, would confess to anything under these grueling circumstances. The text does nonetheless provide a valuable historical perspective on the deeply entrenched misogyny and gender bias prevalent during the early modern period, and shows us exactly what sort of attitude was held by certain members of society, and how extreme some of these views could be. Chapter 6 of The Hammer of Witches doesn't really have a place in modern society. Heck, most of the book doesn't have a place. But it does still shed some light on the perceived association between women and witchcraft that was rampant at that time in history, and shows us why and how some of the atrocities committed during witch hunts came to be. Don't forget to check out the sponsor of today's episode, Enlisted. Play Enlisted for free on PC, PlayStation or Xbox now by using my link in the pinned comment or video description. New players on PC will also receive a special bonus pack that includes multiple items, 4,000 silver, and 3 days of premium account. The offer is available for a limited time only, so make sure not to miss it. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.